All right, so let's now look at some of the structures that are in the lymphatic system. This will be a really short video, but here we go. So the primary structures, there's only two, and secondary structures are going to be all the rest of this chart that's in your book. But here we're going to talk about red bone marrow and the thymus. This chart is an excellent summary, so I do recommend that you read through this either now or come back to it later to summarize things. And when you're studying, make yourself charts that kind of mimic the charts in your book, because that helps you summarize your thoughts on things. Of course, use your own words. Don't just copy things word for word from the book. All right, so back to that original picture, we're talking here about primary lymphatic structures, so your thymus and your red bone marrow. These two structures are involved with forming your lymphocytes, and we talked about that a little bit in the blood chapter, leukopoiesis, and those different lines of hemopoiesis that happen because of the different proteins or colony stimulating factors. And so we're going to produce the cells, and then they either are going to mature in the bone marrow itself, or they may move to the thymus to mature. So first up, let's talk a little bit more about the red bone marrow. So you see a picture over here. Most of this should look very familiar because we've already learned about blood and blood cells a tiny bit. We come back to them in this chapter and in the next chapter to talk more about where they're made, how they're made, and their functions a lot in the next chapter. So, your erythrocytes, your platelets, but mainly what we're talking about here is, in this chapter and the next, is these white blood cells or leukocytes. So remember, all your formed elements except for the T cells, all your formed elements are made in the red bone marrow. And then everybody except your T lymphocytes is going to leave the bone marrow and directly get into the blood. So they mature in the bone marrow. However, the T cells go a different route, and we'll pick back up on those in just a minute. So, this is your hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis, like we talked about in the blood chapter. And it's your lymphoid line as well as some of that myeloid line. But in the lymphoid line, you're going to have your T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. These are your two types of lymphocytes that we're going to talk a whole lot more about in the next chapter. This is a little preview. Your T cells or T lymphocytes are going to be responsible for what we're going to call your cell-mediated immunity in the upcoming chapter. So go ahead and put that in your memory. These are the cells here that are going to have to migrate to your thymus in order to mature. That's actually how they get their name, T cells for thymus. And we say T cells just as an abbreviation of T lymphocytes. And then the B cells, along with all these other cells, are going to be made in the red bone marrow and mature in the red bone marrow. So that's where the B comes from, is that they mature in the bone marrow. So even though they mature in different places, they're both types of lymphocytes or leukocytes, to be more general, but they're going to do very, very different things when we get to their functions in more detail in the next chapter. Your B cells are going to be responsible for a different part of your immunity, and that's called humoral or humoral immunity. So go ahead and try to learn these terms now. T cells, cell-mediated, B cells, humoral immunity. And then your thymus gland is that other primary lymphatic structure. So looking here, this is a picture of your thymus. In a child, it is way larger than it is in an adult. So it kind of regresses or shrinks with age, or you could kind of think of it as just like not growing with you. As you get bigger, your thymus stays almost the same size, although it does shrink a little bit. But it is above your heart. There's your heart there for reference. and it's in that mediastinum, like we've talked about in the heart chapter. So this is where your T lymphocytes are going to go and mature and become activate. Well, not necessarily activated, but mature differentiated T cells. So again, that's where that T comes from in the T lymphocyte name. Again, so big in kids, begins to atrophy about the age of puberty. And we still have it as an adult, but it's really, 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 really small. All right, that's it for for the second one. We'll do the last video on the secondary lymphatic structures.